Hi there, and welcome to this talk on justice for nurses and midwives. It's focused on the UK, but many aspects will translate across to other countries, so maybe it's of use to different places like Australia, New Zealand, possibly the Americas, potentially everywhere. So we've had a report this week on the regulator over-regulating and having a toxic culture, being racist, and in general just a dysfunctional organisation. Doesn't have any leadership. Literally, it doesn't, because the chief exec I've been writing to, this one and the previous one, for decades, they've never really engaged, and now with this report coming out, that chief exec has stepped down. The interim chief exec lasted 4 days and also bailed out. So who's leading it? Well, there's a list of people that have signed a letter to reassure the public with the chair that they are taking the report seriously, they're going to do things. Now, they never have in the past. They're very well paid. They have no understanding of nurses' job, midwives' jobs, or the law about regulation. They just simply prosecute and over-regulate. I'm not saying that they're intending to harm people, they just don't understand what they're doing. So they've got a set of rules and conduct for a profession, quite right and proper for a profession to have that. But how it's implemented, you have trials, almost like trials for the witches, that go on for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years even. When it finishes, another one starts for the same registrant on simple things like, did you hand over your care properly from a home birth to a hospital birth? Did you say anything different from what the hospital says? Well, we're advocating for our clients, we're supporting, we're giving information, evidence-based, all of this. And yet I'm focused a bit more on independent midwives because I work as one on and off for many years, but also I'm a neonatal specialist and I identify with all the nurses, and it's the same situations. When I'm at the NMC, people don't have very good defence often because the lawyers are very well funded for the NMC, almost 100 million just on fitness to practice every year. When the UK post office scandal came out, people were horrified that the lawyers made 100 million. That was a one-off. This is every year. The lawyers for the NMC, the whole case managers, all of them. Basically, relatively minor admin people are paid very high salaries, and you become a manager of a manager, you're paid 200,000, 150,000. Quite junior people are between 30 and 50,000 for just doing administration. Now the nurses and midwives themselves are working 12-hour shifts, very long, hard days of life and death events, and they get quite low salaries. So there's an interest in the NMC feeding itself. This also happens with the trade unions. You've got the College of Nursing, the College of Midwives, Unison. To some extent, they're serving themselves. Occasionally, sometimes they're very helpful to the registrants, to the membership of the union, but not enough. Nobody's challenged the NMC, and challenging it, as I've done, is never really enough. It has to be perhaps court judgments or a public inquiry. So we've got evidence now in this report of the workplace culture being toxic and how that's affected registrants. Tragically, there have been identified in this report 6 suicides of nurses or midwives in the last year. That number is actually likely to be much higher. I don't think it's a true number. It cannot accurately reflect how things are because the people who've done that report, however good it is, have not engaged with lots of organisations and individuals such as myself and many others. And they wouldn't know the people we come into contact who are suicidal, who may have committed suicide, attempted it, or simply considering it. That is a massive impact on their mental health. This has not been looked at. Hopefully the second report due to come out relatively soon. Again, I've not been involved in that, and I welcome them to invite us to participate. I've written to them. Now this report is focused on fitness to practice, so that will look at nurses and midwives more. So these 2 reports are factual evidence of wrongdoing in a public office by the Nursing Midwifery Council UK. It will also demonstrate how they've breached their statutory duty and how they've breached human rights. All of this caused harm. That harm could be called negligent harm. When it's a death that's preventable and avoidable, that can even be gross negligent manslaughter. Now, we know we have other reports on maternal deaths and injuries to mothers and babies that could be avoided and preventable. These reports by Ockenden, Bill Francis, that's Donna Ockenden, Bill Francis, Bill Kirkup, anyway. These reports come out every few years for decades, saying maternity is terrible, mothers and babies are dying, could be saved, they're having unnecessary medical interventions like caesarean when they don't need it, and then when they do need it, they're not getting it. And we've got a fear-based culture. We need to look at the psychology, what drives organisations like hospitals, like the regulator. Now the regulator feel like we just want to regulate, so why in some countries have they got light touch regulation? Even in the UK, they've got light touch regulation in financial institutions, which we saw devastating consequences with. So I'm not saying it's always the best. We need something in the middle, from over-regulation to too light, somewhere in the middle. We've got society full of social media things who have a very fast approach to technology, to changing things, and don't worry about the consequences. So that might be too fast. Now the NMC might be too slow to change. Again, we need balance somewhere in the middle. But what's the psychology that drives people to not just follow the rules, but want to prosecute, persecute and over-regulate and actually manipulate the evidence, not provide information to panels or High Court judges? In some cases I've known very intimately, information's been withheld from panels, and then after the panels reached a decision, in fact sometimes the registrant's too traumatised to go to their own hearing, and nobody tests the prosecution evidence. The panel should, but they don't. They should test and weigh the evidence. That means test the veracity, the accuracy, by questioning everything. Get witnesses in front of them and ask them hard, tough questions about how and why they believe and have said what they have. That's not done. They just take the prosecution, write it up as a judgment, and it's done. And that is why people don't engage always with the NMC. They're desperately upset. They've lost their personal and professional reputation. That's caused great harm, economic loss, and that reputation affects their standing in the community. Maybe they would have done lecturing, community work, volunteering, expert witness, writing reports, engaging even in commercial activities. All of that is gone when somebody loses their registration or even when they're suspended. When they have conditions of practice, those conditions must be workable. Again, they're often not. For example, they make somebody who works in the community say you have to work in a hospital with a supervisor, and they just make conditions unworkable. Nobody looks at it, nobody tests it, and the panels are as rogue as the NMC is itself. They might be kind, nice people. They're on about £500 per day to sit there, and they drag these trials, and they are trials, out for very lengthy periods, often splitting up one case over a few days, a gap of a few weeks, a few more days, another gap and a few more days. That's incredibly hard for the registrant. And they say, oh, we're protecting the public. No, you're not. You're harming the public so often, these regulatory bodies. We've seen with, again, the UK Post Office scandal, the harm that was done with over-regulation. And the public do not trust, do not feel safe with a regulator that has such a toxic culture that's now identified in that report. The next report will show so many other failings. A public inquiry will be very key to put the people who are doing the prosecutions as defendants in a way. Ask them questions. I've written questions for years, for decades. They don't answer. I've written to the chair, I've written to the Privy Council. They don't respond. Just we let them get on with it. They're doing the best they can. And sometimes when they even confess they've made terrible mistakes, they blame it on one person. They write a statement, put it in front of the judge, say, we hold our hand up, we made a mistake. This person's written a statement, sorry about that, judge, can we carry on? And the judge says yes, and they carry on. Persecuting, prosecuting, over-regulating. So the harm has been incalculable. However, there could be some compensation due to people for the costs of going to court. They cannot have their lawyers. The NMC have well-funded in-house and external lawyers, and a registrant has to fund it. If they're in a union, that will. If they're outside a union, they won't. Thank you for listening.